College in Oxford. So Charlotte, you're at St. Cross College in Oxford, and you are an MPhil student with your research concerning in the transmission of vernacular texts in late medieval literary manuscripts. And you're going to talk to us today in particular about the Canterbury Tales. So without further ado, Charlotte, I'll pass over to you, and I will stop my video, mute myself, and only reappear when it's time for you to start thinking about wrapping up. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much. Just to check, can you see my screen? Is that shared properly?
Yep, we can
Lovely.
see it.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely introduction. So I will kick off. The extent to which Chaucer's Canterbury Tales can be considered complete has been thoroughly debated. While some argue the Parson's Tale offers a fittingly devout conclusion akin to a spiritual pilgrimage, nevertheless, the promised return to Canterbury is never fulfilled, and the Squires and Cook's tales lack narrative conclusion. In response to this incompleteness, some 15th century audiences sought to fill the proverbial cracks. These editions have long been deemed spurious, illegitimate, false, and counterfeit. Thomas Tyrwhitt produced the first selected compilation of the tales and did not include the additions, and subsequently they have been omitted from modern volumes. Critics have drawn a firm boundary between canonical and apocryphal texts, and ergo many modern readers are not aware of the corpus of editions. Recent criticism takes a kinder view and considers them worthy of attention, and they've been explored by the likes of Andrew Hickel, but they're still segregated as spurious. Yet when we look at their manuscripts, we see no such distinction. The text flows on uninterrupted. Within this folio lie 4 lines that were added by this manuscript's compiler. The edition is not signaled in colored inks, nor separated with line breaks. According to the manuscript, it is intrinsic to the text. This reflects the way that 15th century audiences understood the editions, and for the purposes of this paper, they will be considered in the same light as components of the Tales family. This manuscript, London, British Library, MS Lansdowne 851, contains 10 such editions, 4 of which are unique to the manuscript. A single text codex of the Tales, it is attributed to southeastern England and dated to 1410 to 20. It is unknown if the editions first appeared in Lansdowne, and they cannot be attributed to the scribe with any certainty. Although not considered central to the Tales tradition, this manuscript is worthy of note for these unique editions that create a sense of cohesion between the tales. They hold a dual function, marking the beginnings and endings of tales and connecting each to the subsequent story so that the entire text appears to be a series of individual tales linked together. This paper will focus on the Lansdowne editions as corrections of Chaucer's tales, to suggest they represent a form of structural correction rather than literary invention. In analysing the apparent mistakes found in these editions, I argue their main concern is not to pay homage to Chaucer's poetry, but rather to magnify the art of telling a story. Critics such as Robert Myer-Lee and Sebastian Langdell have noted that Chaucer's name accrued immense cultural capital in the 15th century. Major poets claim Chaucer as their mentor and a literary forefather whose role they hope to occupy. Hoccleve mentions Chaucer 4 times in his Regiment of Princes, claiming to be acquainted, and Lydgate similarly invokes Master Chaucer in his Troy book, both attempting to associate themselves with the high-style secular poetic tradition that he represents. Yet in contrast, the Lansdowne editions do not identify poetic authority, nor do they cite Chaucer as their inspiration. Instead, they can be understood as the poetry of the public sphere, a concept originated by Jürgen Habermas, who describes the sphere of private people come together as a public, a domain of social life whereby public opinion is formed. Paul Strome further explores the emergence of a public sphere in the 15th century, which he views as a period of common discussion, an arena in which public opinion is shaped by language. The Lansdowne editions participate in this public sphere. Andrew Hickel views them as discernible acts of interactive fiction, comparing the pilgrims in the narrative to active readers who rearrange the tales to introduce new social and literary meanings. Thus, the editions allow us to explore the priorities of their 15th century audience. Just as they contribute to the Chaucer canon, they're equally revealing of the community that created them. The Lansdowne editions fill the gaps in Chaucer's incomplete text, but they can also be read as a form of correction. Other compilers omitted incomplete sections and reordered the tales to compensate for what was understood to be missing. 56 editions survive in manuscripts, forming a community of readership that was concerned with altering the tales to make it meet their expectations of a complete, correct text. Recent research into 15th century scribal practice reveals that manuscript transmission was influenced by ideas of correct literature. Daniel Wakelin argues that the verbal artifact is the focus of the scribe's attention in copying and correcting texts. He suggests medieval scribes demonstrated a recognition and indeed an expectation of the possibility of textual correctness, and were conscious of both the material book and the words of the text they wrote. He concludes that scribal corrections, quote, present the poem as though it could be got factually right, as though that mattered. I suggest we see such correction in the Lansdowne editions because they complete Chaucer's poem by continuing patterns encountered throughout the tales. The first of these patterns is witnessed in the host's role as master of ceremonies. Chaucer's host links the pilgrims' tales by interjecting into the narrative to invite the next story. The editions continue this pattern by inserting his character into the links, and in doing so, they create a sense of seamless unity and reveal their concern with the poem's fluidity. We find such an addition between the pardoner's and shipman's tales. Standing in for the shipman's prologue, it bridges the literary gap with an invitation by the host for the next tale. Opening the edition with "but" is an intriguing choice on behalf of the composer, as it continues the pattern where the host uses paritatic conjunctions to continue the storytelling flow, and also ties the poem and edition together in a bold statement of unity. In an instance of unconscious irony, it also speaks to both the social friction between the characters in the tales, but also between Chaucer's incomplete poem and the audience who seek to correct it. Although the host's words are brief, they're clearly composed by an individual who is well versed in the tales. The imperative master address is taken from Chaucer's vocabulary, appearing 60 times in this manuscript. Chaucer creates a sense of community by describing the host as our, a feature the edition uses to its advantage to support the sense of cohesion. It makes the fictional pilgrims part of a public themselves, the manuscript's own public sphere, where characters and readers exist in a space of collaboration. The manipulation of the host's character highlights the composer's desire to correct the text by continuing the tale's pattern. However, this imitation should not instantly be read as reverence to Chaucer. It is also important to note what is absent. Although the editions invoke the host's authority and are clearly concerned with continuity, they're also notable for their brevity. They do not attempt to add to or change the host's character. Instead, they merely cite him as a transition tool. Whilst their brevity may serve some practical purpose, perhaps an economy of ink and parchment or time, the links are remarkably efficient and driven by function. Their handling of the host reveals their concern with seamless transitions, a form of structural correction rather than literary invention. The second way the Lansdowne editions correct the tales is by continuing the pattern of Chaucer's language. By repeating specific phrases and words, the editions draw on the poem's semantic field to ensure an overarching sense of lexical unity. This link from the canon's yeoman's tale to the physician's features the most references to Chaucer's language. The physician's tale is left without a prologue, so Lansdowne features an addition to correct this, where the host reflects on the previous tale and recalls details to draw threads between the poem and edition. He describes the canon's yeoman's pallid complexion from blowing coal, alluding to his prologue. Careful attention is paid to verbs, specifically his meddling, which is used twice in this tale, twice in Melody, and once in Parsons, attempting symmetry to the edition's interference with Chaucer's tales. This link also draws on idioms used in the tale, such as the repetition of devil way, which is taken from the canon's yeoman's prologue and is also used by the host in other tales. The attention to verbal detail not only reveals the comprehensive knowledge of the composer, but also reflects their concern with continuity and cohesion. It was evidently important to locate these editions within the linguistic context of Chaucer's works. A final example that bears witness to these editions as acts of correction is seen in their resolution of incomplete tales. Twice in Lansdowne, Chaucer's characters break off mid-tale and the resulting plot hole is justified by the editions. When the cook unexpectedly ends his tale mid-sentence, many manuscripts, including Lansdowne, insert the romance of Gamlin. However, Lansdowne uniquely features this link also. Rather than simply inventing an ending, the edition alludes to the completeness of the tale, but justifies its absence with the cook's claim that it is foul. This moment of courtesy is surprising, considering his characterization as a lewd drunk. Critics such as Stephen Partridge have argued that this is a superficial oversight. However, considering the attention to verbal detail and the acute understanding of Chaucer's structure seen in the previous links, it seems unlikely that this is a mere misreading. We see a similar technique in the Squire Wife of Bath link. Again, the squire's tale cuts off, and to justify this, Lansdowne features an edition where the squire proclaims he will make a knot in his tale. Again, criticism is skeptical. John Manley and Edith Rickert are scathing of the squire's claim, arguing this link implies that the writer had access to a complete copy of the tales. However, I suggest that this is the very point of these editions. The number of themes the squire sets forth at the start of the tale would make it the longest tale in the text if it were complete, so it is logical for Chaucer to cut it short. For the edition's composer, the important thing is not that it is unfinished, but that the ending is understood to be known. This alludes to a greater expansion of the tale outside of the codex and maintains a sense of completeness. It also evokes a literary community beyond the pilgrims that form the public sphere of the poem. The composer is keen, it seems, to reassure us that the complete tale exists just out of sight. As we've seen so far, the Lansdowne editions are meticulous in their verbal detail and consistency. However, works that appear alongside Chaucer's are often compared and found deficient, and the editions are read in the same light. Some of their metrical and narrative features have been called out as mistakes, but I argue these apparent mistakes are not due to a lack of poetic skill or ability, but rather demonstrate a different set of priorities. I suggest instead that their composer is more interested in the structural frame and device of the storytelling contest than Chaucer's metrics or poetic artistry. One of these mistakes is found in the squire wife of Bathlink. After declaring he will knot his tail, the squire claims he will finish his story when it is next his turn. However, both the edition's composer and scribe would have been well aware that this is an unfulfilled promise. Although the host sets out a structure where each pilgrim tells 4 tales, many are left untold. So why does the edition continue this unattainable promise? I suggest this is a demonstration of loyalty to the device of the storytelling contest. Chaucer's host introduces the drawing of lots in the general prologue, and the structural framework of the tales is dependent on this promise of future stories, regardless of the incomplete conclusion. The edition's composer chooses to follow this structure by alluding to a literary future that they know will never arrive. This prioritizes a sense of linearity in the tale's composition over the completeness of the text. A second feature often understood to be a mistake is the lack of consistent meter. Although every edition maintains Chaucer's rhyming couplets, their syllabic count fluctuates, and this is often understood to be a lack of skill. The link between the canon's yeoman's and physician's tales is the most evident example. When looking at the leaf, some lines of the edition are almost double the length of the main poem, extending into the margin as far as the lines below that follow the decorated initial. In comparison with Chaucer's decasyllabic meter, the first line of the edition contains 17 syllables, abandoning the 5-stress line of the tales. This metrical anomaly has been read as an imperfection of manuscript transmission. Yet instead of a lack of skill, why not a lack of concern? The Lansdowne non-engagement with Chaucer's metrics can equally be read as ambivalence. In maintaining the rhyme scheme, the editions ensure the musical pattern of the poem continues. This in itself is not remarkable. The couplet was one of the most popular patterns of end rhyme in English poetry. The content and sonic pattern of the verse instead take priority, a decision that resonates with the edition's focus on the immaterial idea of the tales despite the poem's material form. The apparent mistakes prioritize the craft of storytelling, the act of transmitting words, over Chaucer's metrics. It is important to recognize that scribal emendation of Chaucer's meter in the 15th century was prevalent, and therefore, whilst the discrepancies may appear jarring to our modern perspective, given scribal variation, these differences may have felt less un-Chaucerian to a contemporary reader. Yet distinct from Chaucer's poetry in length, meter, and rhythm, this difference is suggestive of the priorities of their composer. Their main concern is not to pay homage to Chaucer, but rather to magnify the art of telling a story. To return to the public sphere, the edition's lack of concern for Chaucer's poetic artistry shows their participation in the wider literary context of emendation and editing. Lansdowne sits within a corpus where individual manuscript transmission involved interaction with the tales. The collaborative structure of the storytelling game provides both the foundation for the text and reflects the public sphere it sits within. The edition's handling of the host character reveals their concern with seamless transitions, and by drawing on Chaucer's vocabulary, they further ensure this overarching sense of unity. Yet it is in the apparent mistakes of the editions that their concerns are made most evident. In prioritizing the narrative cohesion and sonic pattern, they reveal an indifference towards Chaucer as poet and instead highlight the structural form, frame, and device of the storytelling contest. Unlike other editions, such as the lengthy Canterbury interlude found in Northumberland MS 455, the defining feature of the Lansdowne manuscript is its unified structure. Yet whilst they represent a form of structural correction rather than literary invention, as a work of poetry themselves, they inadvertently make the structural literary. As these editions represent an early stage of the tale's transmission, it is surprising they reflect the sense of public sphere. An awareness of the literary environment and assumed readership is reiterated in every codex that contains editions. Considering the 80+ manuscripts that contain parts of the tales and the 56 editions, the manuscript tradition of Chaucer's poem comes to represent a long history of readerly interaction. Whilst every manuscript has distinct priorities in presenting the text, certain incomplete tales demand intervention to ensure the poem's fluidity. In these editions, we see a similar interest in the structural frame and the device of the storytelling contest that is the distinctive feature of the Lansdowne editions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was fascinating.